Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little for mypokercoaching.com, and I'm here today with my top 10 tips to help you crush small stakes poker tournaments. Let's get right to it. Tip number 1 is to play tight early on, especially in big pots when your opponent wants to put a lot of money in the pot. You cannot win in the first level, but you certainly can lose. Understand that stealing the blinds is relevant, but actually not all that valuable early in a tournament when you're playing 200 or 300 big blinds deep. So your main concern early in a tournament is to just hang out and see what your opponents are doing. You want to figure out their tendencies so you can take advantage of them later in the tournament when a whole lot more money is on the line. Now, when I say you want to play tightly, I don't mean you want to only play the absolute best hands before the flop. You actually should splash around in tiny pots with hands that have the potential to turn into very strong hands after the flop. These are going to be hands like small pairs, suited aces, and suited connectors. And essentially, you want to look to stack your opponent. You want to win all their money when you make a hand that can beat pocket aces after the flop. A lot of your opponents will play kind of tightly pre-flop, but then they drastically overplay those hands after the flop. If they get any overpair, they may just load their 200 big blind stack in the pot. And if you're sitting there playing hands that can make straights and flushes, and you make a straight or flush, and your opponent's trying to get all the money in, that's fantastic, and you can get a double up early on very frequently. But you have to make sure that you are not the player who is overplaying hands like top pair or an overpair. Tip number 2 is to raise often and to raise using a small size. Do not open limp. That means do not just call the big blind if you are the first player to enter the pot. Now, if players just call the big blind before you, you can certainly call behind with that range of hands that stands to beat a hand like pocket aces. You do not want to be limping behind with king 7 offsuit. That's just asking for trouble. But, king 7 suited is a little bit better. It's a hand that can make a very good flush. Obviously, you'd rather have suited aces, suited connectors, pairs, etc. When you're first to act, though, when you're the first one who could potentially raise, if your hand is good enough to play, you should be raising it. Especially as stacks start to get a little bit shallower, like 50 big blinds and shorter, you're going to want to raise to 2 or 2.5 big blinds. And as your position improves, as you get closer to the button, as you get closer to acting last, before and after the flop, you should play a much wider range. You can play substantially wider when you are on the button compared to when you are first to act. So make sure you take advantage of your position. Tip number 3 is to defend your big blind often, perhaps more often than you may be accustomed to. And that's because in a tournament, at least compared to a cash game, there's an ante in play in most tournaments today, and there's also no rake taken out of any individual pot. And this allows you to defend your big blind quite wide when it's just you and the initial raiser. Now, if it's you and a raiser and a caller and a caller and a caller, you actually have to be a little bit tighter in the big blind, even though you're getting better pot odds, because your junky hands like king 6 offsuit and 7-5 offsuit are just way more likely to be dominated. But heads up, you get to defend very wide. Let's take a look at how you would play when you are 60 big blinds deep, so middle or early stages of a tournament, and you are in the big blind against a button raise. As you see, we have this chart here. The hands in red are re-raised, and the hands in green are called, and the hands in blue are folded. First, let's take a look at the hands that are re-raising. Most people do not re-raise or 3-bet adequately. When you're in the big blind against a raise, you're going to want to make it something like 4 times their initial raise in terms of your sizing. So if they make it 2.5 big blinds, make it something like 10. You need to raise large because you completely lack position. So in this scenario, 60 big blinds deep, you're re-raising with something like pocket 8s and better, ace 10 and better, king 10 suited and better, king queen offsuit and better, and then some bluffs. And you're going to find that a lot of the best bluffs when you're deep stacked are going to come from suited connected hands and suited aces and suited kings and some suited queens and some suited jacks. So we see here like 10-9 suited, 8-6 suited, 10-6 suited, king 6 suited, and ace 5 suited are 3-betting. These are hands you're going to make it 8 or 9 or 10 big blinds with against your opponent's initial raise. That may feel uncomfortable to you, but it is something you need to do. That way, when you do re-raise, your opponent's decision is not easy because they just know you have a really good hand. We do also have a smattering of other offsuit bluffing hands like king 10 offsuit, queen 9 offsuit, and jack 8 offsuit, which I think are hands you certainly should include. But if you just want to use all decent suited hands, like instead of re-raising queen 7 suited half the time, maybe re-raise it every time. I think that's perfectly fine. Now let's take a look at the hands that are calling. And it's pretty much everything else except for the absolute worst offsuit hands. Now this chart here presumes that you play perfectly after the flop. And the problem with us mere humans is that a lot of us cannot play these absolute worst offsuit hands after the flop very well from out of position. So I would recommend you actually fold out some of these hands, like 5-3 offsuit, 6-4 offsuit, 8-5 offsuit, 10-5 offsuit, Jack-4 offsuit. Jack-4 offsuit's terrible. You really don't need to play that hand. Queen-3 offsuit, etc. But like every suited hand should be called when you are facing a small preflop raise. If your opponents are raising bigger preflop, like say they make it 4 big blinds instead of 2 or 2.25, then you should fold out substantially more because then you're getting worse odds. But against a small raise, you do have to defend very wide. This pattern of re-raising with the suited connected type hands and suited blocker type hands as bluffs will usually hold true when you are roughly 40 big blinds deep and deeper. As you start to get shallower, you need to make sure you are using a slightly different strategy because you are playing short stacked. Tip number 4 is to continuation bet less often. If, and only if, your opponents are way too weak and way too passive, then sure, you can continuation bet every time after the flop. To be clear, a continuation bet is when you raise before the flop, someone calls, and then on the flop, either they check or you're first to act, and you have to decide if you want to bet. Back in the day, people would just play way too straightforwardly. They would fold unless they had anything, so you could bet every time because your opponent was going to miss the flop 60% of the time or so. And if you can make a small bet and win the pot half the time or more, it's very, very valuable. But nowadays, most people know how to fight back. So you should continuation bet closer to the GTO strategy, which usually has you only betting every time when you have a big range and nut advantage. And you won't very often unless the board should connect very well with the range that you started with. So if you are the preflop raiser, you're going to find that you should usually bet way less often on middle and low connected boards like 7-6-3 against the big blind. Because if you consider your initial raising range from any position and the big blind's calling range, the big blind is going to have hands like 5-4 offsuit and 7-6 offsuit, whereas you will not be raising 5-4 offsuit or 7-6 offsuit from any positions besides maybe the button. And even then it's kind of loose. So you're going to find that on the low middle connected type boards, you're going to be way more inclined to check because this is just not a good board for you. And if you bet these spots every time, your decent opponents are going to check raise you a lot and put you in a miserable scenario with all of your unpaired hands. And you will have a lot of unpaired hands on those boards. Tip number 5 is to consider the future streets. Always consider what will happen after you make your action. And if you really don't want to get raised, such as when you have middle pair, it's often best to not bet. What a lot of people do wrong is they continuation bet every time, they get raised, and they have a hand like middle pair that could be good, but probably not. And instead of betting, just let it go check. You're going to find that a lot of hands in No Limit Hold'em that are not very good don't really mind if it just checks down. You're going to find that you want to play big pots with your best hands, plus some bluffs, and you're going to play small pots with your small and medium strength hands, your weakish hands. If you do not want to play for all of your chips, keep the pot small early in the hand. This definitely comes up with draws. A lot of people think they should bet with their draws every single time. Like say you raise before the flop with Jack 10, somebody calls and it comes 9-7-3. You have a gut shot, straight draw, and 2 overcards. In that spot, if your opponent checks and you bet, let's say you bet 4 big blinds and you're playing 25 big blinds deep, your opponent can just shove all in on you. That's a reasonable play they should do, especially because that board should connect pretty well with them. And then you have to fold out Jack 10 there. But Jack 10 actually has a lot of outs. You have 6 outs to make top pair, and you have 4 outs to make the nut straight. And you don't really want to be betting and folding when you have 10 reasonable outs. So instead, you very often have to check back the Jack high. I know it sounds crazy, but if you bet and get shoved, it's awful. So to mitigate that, when you start to get shallower stacked, you just have to check it back and then consider bluffing on the turn when you now have half as much equity when you miss because you just have 1 more card to come. So always consider what can happen on the future betting rounds. If you do not want to get raised off your hand, usually best to not bet it. Tip number 6 is to play more hands in the later levels. An easy way to win money from poker is to make your opponents fold when they have lots of equity. Kind of like I just said, right? If you have that Jack 10 and 10 outs, if your opponent can check raise you, well, they're going to smash you, right? They're going to beat you very badly. You want to be doing that to your opponents. you're going to find that many players overfold. They fold too often when their entire stack is at risk or when it could potentially be at risk on a later betting round. So you're going to want to consider raising a little bit wider than the GTO charts recommend using a too big blind raise, because your opponents will very often fold too often. And if you can push your opponents around with small bets, that's going to result in lots of little pots trickling your direction, and your stack is going to slowly trickle upwards. And then, of course, you still have to win your big hands, but you're usually going to get to be able to lose 2 hands before going broke, and your opponents are all going to get to lose 1 hand before going broke, and that is good for you. Also, as you get to the later levels, the stack depths are going to start to get shallower, so make sure you study solid push-fold strategy. Tip number 7 is to use bubbles to your advantage. A bubble is when there is a payout jump. The first payout jump happens when you go from getting no money to getting in the money. And you're going to find that many players really want to get in the money. Another time where there's a bubble is when there's a final table, especially a TV final table, because a lot of players really want to get on TV. So in both these scenarios, especially if you have a big stack or perhaps even a middle stack, you can push these players around, assuming they do care about that bubble. Now, everyone will not care about the same things. Some people don't care about getting on TV at all. Some players only want to play for the win. But for the most part, you're going to find that most people care about money and they care about fame. So you can find spots where, as a big stack, you can push your opponents around and really chip up in those scenarios. Now, if you don't have a big stack or potentially a medium stack and you have a short stack instead, very often your goal is to just hang out, recognizing you are going to give up an amazing chance to win the tournament in exchange for winning the tournament less often, but collecting more money. It's a little bit unfortunate, but you have to realize sometimes it is what it is. And actually, a lot of the biggest winners in tournament poker don't win the tournaments all that often. They take a whole lot of seconds and thirds, but second and third place way more money than 8th or 9th or 10th, right? So you're going to find that just hanging out and collecting payout jumps is very often the right strategy, especially if your opponents are in there battling against each other. Tip number 8 is to learn about ICM. ICM is the independent chip model, and it helps determine the accurate strategy when there are payout implications. ICM is a big topic. We're not going to discuss it thoroughly in this video, but essentially you need to know that pairs, well, small pairs, and suited connectors go way down in value. 5-4 suited is not a playable hand when you are at a final table or when there's a big payout jump. Same thing for hands like pocket threes. Normally they're pretty good, but not in these scenarios at all. You're also going to find that hands like ace-x suited, king-x suited, and 2 big cards go way up in value. And that's because if someone raises and you go all in with these hands, the fact that you have an ace, a king, or 2 big cards in your hand makes it way less likely your opponent has a hand that they can call you with. And when there are payout implications, you essentially really don't want to get called. Because imagine you are in a scenario where there are 4 players remaining in a tournament, and you all have 25% of the chips. And there's a normal tournament payout structure where first gets a lot and fourth gets not a lot. If you and somebody else gets all in, one of you is going to take 4th place, the last place, right? And the other person who wins now has half the chips in play, but they're certainly not guaranteed to win the tournament, right? And because of that, anytime you get it all in, roughly flipping, in a final table, the payouts that you no longer can get if you lose, that money gets distributed to the other players who are not in the hand. Essentially what happens at a final table is you make money by folding. So you really don't want to get all in and called. And having an ace or a king or 2 big cards will result in you getting called way less often. Another thing at final tables is that the big stacks get to raise far wider than they would if there were no payout implications, because everybody else has to be kind of tight, right? And you're also going to find that the short stacks use way fewer non-all-in bets. There are plenty of spots where if you're playing, let's say, 25 big blinds deep, where if someone raises, you should 3-bet, and if they shove, you then call or fold appropriately. But when there are big payout implications and you are re-raising a big stack, you should expect the big stack to shove a lot. But again, you don't really want to get all in. So say someone does raise and you have a hand like ace-queen offsuit, perhaps a hand that you can normally very happily 3-bet small and then call an all in. Well, at a final table, you're going to find very often you just want to go all in yourself because you really don't want to get called, even though you have the best hand a lot of the time, because you just don't want to be all in and called. Because again, your equity gets distributed to the people who folded, and that's bad for you. ICM's a big topic. Maybe we'll make a video on it one day. If you want a video on that one day, or anything else, let us know in the comment section down below. We read all of them, and we want to give you the content that you want. Tip number 9 is to study preflop charts regularly. You must know fundamentally sound preflop strategy. I hate to break it to you, you have to do the study. You need to learn these charts by heart. If you are guessing about what to do in common scenarios, and your opponents know what to do in common scenarios, assuming they actually do it, which they will, you will lose. You can't just guess and play by the seat of your pants anymore. You do have to know good, strong, fundamentally sound poker, especially in all the common spots. And before the flop, well, those scenarios come up every single hand. If you're messing those up on a regular basis, you will lose. Be sure to download our free poker cheat sheet. We'll be sure to have a link below. So make sure you get that, and that will include some pre-flop charts for you. And tip number 10 is to play in the right tournaments. Understand that you win when your opponents make more mistakes than you. So you want to make sure you're playing when your opponents will make more mistakes than you. This is usually going to be at somewhat small and medium stakes. It's usually going to be on nights and weekends and when there are big guarantees. Essentially, you want to play when people are in there gambling. Realize that just because a game exists does not mean that you have to play it, though. So many people think that because there's a $1,500 tournament that happens at their casino once every 3 months, that they have to go play it, even if they're not properly bankrolled. And taking big shots without a legitimately good reason does not make sense. You must have discipline, and you must keep a proper bankroll. Poker is an amazing way to get rich slowly, even though I know everyone wants to get rich quickly. The way you win at poker, there's actually only 3 things you have to do. You have to, number 1, find a game you can beat. If you have an edge, that's step number 1. Step number 2, play the game a lot. You need to get in there and you need to grind. If you only play once every month with your friends for a small amount of money, yeah, you may win money, but not a whole lot, right? So find a game you can beat, play it a lot. And number 3, this is where a lot of people fall apart. You have to keep a proper bankroll. If you do those 3 things, you will win at poker in the long run. If you do not do those 3 things, you may get lucky and win, but more often than not, you'll lose. And I want to make sure that you are set up for success. So find a game you can beat, play it a lot, and keep a proper bankroll. That's going to be it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor. Click the like and subscribe button down below. Also click the notification bell. We have a lot of amazing videos coming out on this channel, and I want to be sure you are aware of them. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Make the most of your opportunities, and get in there and crush the tournaments. Thanks for watching.